For 17 years, a giant anaconda lay coiled at the same bend of the river. It never hunted, it never attacked, it never left. Boats drifted toward it and stopped. People fell into the water and survived, and no one drowned there again. The villagers called it a monster. The authorities called it a threat, but they were all wrong, because the anaconda wasn't guarding the river. It was guarding what the river had taken, and once you understand why it stayed, you'll never look at animals or grief the same way again. Stay until the end. The truth doesn't arrive quickly, but when it does, it stays with you. The river had always been the village's lifeline. It carried fish in the early mornings, reflected the sky at noon, and swallowed the sun every evening without ceremony. Children learned to swim in its shallows before they learned to read. Old men remembered its moods the way others remembered birthdays. The river gave, and when it took, it did so quietly. No drama, no warnings. That was before the bend. The bend sat just beyond the last cluster of wooden houses, where the water slowed and widened, pressing against a low bank of reeds and pale stones. From a distance it looked harmless, almost gentle. But no boat passed there anymore. No nets were cast. No songs drifted across it at dawn. The bend had become a blank space in the village's memory, a place spoken of only with lowered voices and shortened sentences. It began one morning without thunder or signs. A fisherman named Raoul pushed off before sunrise, rowing alone as he had done for decades. When the fog lifted, he saw it, coiled along the bank like a fallen tree that breathed. The anaconda was immense, not just long, but thick, its body layered in slow, patient loops, skin patterned like dark water under leaves. It did not raise its head. It did not strike. It simply existed, heavy and still, as if the river itself had decided to rest there. Raoul turned back without casting his net. He did not run. He did not shout. By noon, the story had spread anyway. At first, people treated it like a passing danger. Snakes moved, predators hunted. Someone would scare it off. Someone always did. But days passed, then weeks. The anaconda remained. It shifted with the sun, adjusted with the waterline, but never left the bend. Chickens wandered too close and were not taken. Dogs barked from a distance and were ignored. Even the river seemed to move differently around that place, as if it were careful. Fear settled in quietly, the way humidity does, felt more than seen. Parents warned their children without explaining why. Fishermen changed routes without complaining. The bend became a curve on the map that no one touched. "It's waiting," someone said once, and no one asked what for. Seasons turned. The anaconda grew. Not rapidly, not in a way that felt unnatural, but steadily, year by year, as if time itself were feeding it. Its presence became routine, and routine made the fear sharper, not duller. A danger that stays is worse than one that passes. A thing that watches without acting invites the imagination to do the work. Stories filled the silence. Some said the snake was cursed. Others said it had eaten something sacred and could not move on. A few whispered that it was guarding treasure beneath the water. Those voices were laughed away, but the laughter was thin. No one went to look. What unsettled the village most was not the size of the anaconda, nor the simple fact of its existence. It was the stillness. Predators paced. They hunted. They reacted. This one did not. It lay there through heat and rain, through storms that bent trees and floods that tore loose docks upstream. When the water rose, the anaconda adjusted its coils, anchoring itself against the current. When debris rushed past, it did not flee. It held. Once during a sudden swell, a small boat broke loose from its rope and drifted toward the bend. People watched from shore, expecting the worst. The boat struck the coils and stopped, rocking gently, unharmed. The snake did not tighten. It did not turn. The boat was pulled back with shaking hands and no words. After that, no one called the anaconda a monster out loud. They still feared it. They still avoided the bend. But something had shifted. An unease layered with confusion, then something closer to doubt. If it meant to kill, why hadn't it? If it meant to leave, why hadn't it? Years passed like this. 17 of them, measured not by calendars, but by absence. No drownings at the bend, no attacks, no movement beyond that narrow stretch of riverbank. Children grew up and learned the rule without ever hearing its origin. You don't go there. And the anaconda remained, vast and quiet, a living boundary between what the village knew and what it refused to understand. People said it was waiting. They were right. They just didn't know. For what? Time did what fear could not. It turned the anaconda from a shock into a fact. By the 3rd year, people no longer stopped mid-sentence when they mentioned the bend. By the 7th, children who had never known the river without the snake spoke of it the way they spoke of old trees or broken bridges, dangerous, yes, but permanent. By the 17th year, the anaconda had become something else entirely. A constant. It was always there, not close to the village, not hidden deep in the jungle, but exactly where the river curved and slowed, where the current pressed hardest against the bank before releasing itself downstream. The snake did not drift. It did not wander. Fishermen who kept their distance swore that if you marked the spot with a pole one season, the anaconda would be coiled there the next, its massive body aligned with the same stones, the same reeds, as if it recognized the place more clearly than the people did. The seasons tested it. Dry months pulled the river thin and exposed mud along the banks. Rains returned and erased those lines overnight. Floods came, violent and fast, lifting debris and snapping ropes. Each time the anaconda adjusted, not by leaving, but by positioning itself. When the water rose, it coiled tighter, anchoring its weight against the force of the current. When the river fell, it settled lower, resting along the damp earth, patient and unhurried. People began to notice patterns they hadn't wanted to see before. During floods, logs and broken planks that should have smashed into the bend instead piled up upstream, caught and redirected by the snake's body. Small boats that slipped their moorings drifted toward that curve and stopped there, as if pressed gently into stillness. Once a fisherman lost his footing and was dragged by the current. He struck the water near the bend and vanished beneath the surface. Shouts followed. Panic. Then, moments later, the man surfaced closer to shore than expected, coughing and shaking but alive. He never spoke of what he felt beneath the water, only that something solid had slowed him down. No one called it protection. The word felt too large, too dangerous to say aloud. But unease crept in where certainty had lived before. The anaconda was not behaving like a hunter. Animals disappeared from other parts of the river, taken by predators as they always had been, but near the bend life continued. Birds drank at the edge. Smaller snakes crossed the water undisturbed. Even capybaras wandered near the reeds, alert but unharmed. The size of the anaconda became impossible to ignore. It thickened with the years, its coils growing broader, its presence heavier, as if the river itself had condensed around it. Visitors from nearby villages came to look from a distance, whispering and pointing. Some brought phones, capturing blurred images they later claimed were exaggerated by fear. Others left offerings, fruit, flowers, small bundles of reeds, placed at the edge of the water and quickly abandoned, as if apology alone might be enough. The elders argued among themselves. Snakes, they said, did not stay in one place without reason. Hunger moved them, mating seasons moved them, threats moved them. This one had endured all of it without change. It had outlived storms that erased houses upstream. It had outlasted fishermen who once swore they would drive it away. It had watched children become adults and adults grow old, all from the same silent position. "What does it want?" someone asked once, standing far back from the water. No one answered because by then the question felt wrong. The anaconda did not act like something waiting to take. It acted like something that had already lost. Its stillness was not tense but heavy, the weight of a body that had chosen a place and refused to abandon it. The river flowed around it, changing every day, while the snake remained unchanged. A dark line of memory pressed into the curve of the land. By the end of the 17th year, fear had softened into something more complicated. People still avoided the bend, but they no longer spoke of it as cursed. They spoke of it as watched, as if the river there remembered something the village had tried and failed to forget. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they began to understand that the anaconda was not guarding the river from them. It was staying for something the river had taken. No one in the village liked to talk about the flood anymore, not because it was ancient history, but because it was close enough to remember clearly and far enough to pretend it no longer mattered. The river had flooded before, many times in fact, but that night was different. That night had weight. It lingered in the way conversations stopped when rain fell too hard, and in the way elders watched the water rise with an expression that was not fear, but recognition. It had begun with rain that refused to slow, not the kind that came in bursts, but the kind that pressed down without pause, hour after hour, until the ground gave up trying to absorb it. By evening the river was already swollen, its surface churning with broken branches and foam. Still, life went on. People had learned to live alongside water that threatened them. They trusted its patterns. They trusted themselves. The ferry was never meant to run that night. Everyone knew that. But there were too many people waiting on the far side, workers returning home, children clutching school bags, a mother carrying an infant wrapped in cloth. The operator hesitated. Then the rain eased, just slightly, enough to feel like permission. The ferry pushed off, its engine struggling against the current, its deck crowded with bodies standing shoulder to shoulder. From the shore, the lights drifted away, blurred by rain. From the ferry, the village became a smear of darkness and sound. Halfway across, the river changed its mind. A surge slammed into the side of the boat, tilting it sharply. Someone screamed. The engine choked. Another wave followed, stronger, lifting the ferry at an angle that no hands could correct. Water rushed across the deck. People slipped. A child was torn from a grip that had held tight seconds before. The ferry twisted once, then rolled, its lights vanishing beneath the surface as if the river had closed its eyes. The water was everywhere, cold, violent, blind. Bodies collided, wood splintered. The river did not roar, it pulled. It dragged people under and spun them through darkness, filling mouths and lungs without malice or intent. Some fought, some froze, some disappeared without sound. When it was over, the river looked calm again. That was what unsettled those who stood on the banks afterward. The rain softened. The current slowed. The bend, swollen and wide, held debris against its edge like a collection of things it refused to release. Rescue came late. It always does. By dawn, survivors huddled in blankets, shaking, staring at the water as if it might speak. The dead were counted in quiet voices. Names were repeated, then crossed out, then repeated again. Some bodies were recovered downstream, others were never found. The official story settled quickly. An overloaded ferry, poor judgment, a storm that turned suddenly. The river was blamed, then forgiven the way it always was. Memorials were held, candles were lit, life resumed unevenly, but there were details no one put into reports. The bend had taken the worst of it. Debris from the ferry collected there, planks, torn fabric, a single shoe pressed into the mud. For days, people searched along that stretch of riverbank, wading carefully, calling out names that no longer answered. It was there, among the reeds and broken branches, that something else began to change. Weeks after the flood, when the water had retreated and the mud cracked under the sun, the first rumors started. Fishermen spoke of movement near the bend. Not fast, not threatening, just heavy. A presence where there had been none before. By the time the anaconda was seen clearly, the ferry had already faded into memory, filed away as a tragedy the village had survived. No one connected the two, not at first. It was easier to believe the snake had simply arrived. Rivers carried things, floods reshaped land. An anaconda appearing after a disaster felt natural, almost expected. What no one wanted to consider was that the river had not only taken lives that night, it had taken something else, and it had left something behind to remember it. For years, the village spoke of the flood as a number. How many boarded the ferry? How many were pulled from the water? How many never came home? Numbers were easier than faces, easier than voices, easier than remembering what it felt like to be dragged under a river that did not care whether you lived or died. But there was one name that was never counted among the dead. Matteo had been 7 years old that night. He remembered very little of the ferry itself, just the press of bodies, the smell of wet cloth, the way his mother's hand tightened around his wrist when the boat lurched. He remembered the scream, not whose it was, only that it cut through the rain like something sharp and alive. And then he remembered water. Too much water. Everywhere. For most of his life, that was where the memory ended. People said he was lucky, miraculously lucky. The river had spared him, they said, as if the river had ever made choices. His mother did not survive. Neither did the man standing behind them, or the woman who had been holding a basket of bread. Matteo was found hours later, half-conscious on the muddy bank near the bend, wedged between reeds and debris, breathing but silent. He never spoke about what happened beneath the surface. As he grew older, people noticed things about him. He avoided the river even on hot days. He startled at sudden pressure, sudden movement. When asked about the flood, his answers were short and imprecise, as if the memory were blurred or incomplete. Doctors said it was trauma, that the mind protected itself by erasing what it could not carry. Matteo accepted that explanation. It was easier than questioning a blank space that felt heavy whenever he approached it. It wasn't until he was grown, with children of his own, that the memories began to shift. One afternoon, standing far back from the bend, Matteo watched the anaconda as he had many times before. The snake lay motionless, its massive body pressed against the earth, water sliding past it in slow ribbons. For reasons he could not explain, a sensation rose in his chest, not fear but pressure, the same dull, encompassing force he had felt in dreams he could never fully remember. That night, the dreams changed. He was underwater again, but not spinning, not panicking. He felt something solid beneath him, something broad and unmoving. The current pushed him forward, but the pressure held, steady and firm, guiding rather than trapping. He wasn't crushed, he wasn't bitten, he was slowed, redirected. When he woke, his hands were shaking. Over the following weeks, fragments surfaced, not images but sensations, weight without pain, strength without violence, the absence of teeth. Matteo realized that what he had always assumed was chaos had, in one brief moment, been controlled. Something had interrupted the river's pull long enough for him to surface, long enough for him to be carried toward shore instead of dragged under. The thought frightened him more than the memory of drowning ever had. He returned to the bend, standing at a distance he had sworn never to cross. The anaconda lay where it always had, ancient and unmoving. For the first time, Matteo did not see a predator. He saw a presence, a mass that belonged to the water in a way people never could. He did not tell anyone what he was thinking, not his wife, not the elders, not the fishermen who still spoke in half-whispers about the snake. He knew how it would sound. He knew how easily fear turned into ridicule, and ridicule into dismissal. Instead, he listened. Others had stories too, stories they had never connected, never placed beside one another. A handhold that appeared where none should have been. A moment of resistance in the current. Survivors who reached the bank sooner than expected, carried sideways instead of downstream. Each account alone meant nothing. Together they formed a shape that was impossible to ignore. The anaconda had arrived after the flood. It had stayed at the bend, and the river since then had not taken another life there. Matteo stood watching the water until the light began to fade, a realization settling over him with a weight he could finally name. Whatever the anaconda was doing, it had begun on the night the ferry capsized, and it had begun with saving a child who never understood how he lived. Until now. The first person to say it out loud was the last person anyone expected. She was called Doña Elira, and she had lived beside the river longer than anyone could remember. Her house sat on higher ground, far enough from the bend to be safe, close enough that the river's breath still reached her windows at night. People knew her as quiet, sharp-eyed, and stubborn in the way only age could justify. She had lost family to the flood, like many others, but unlike most, she never went near the memorials. She never placed candles by the water. She never spoke of forgiveness. When the authorities came again, clipboards in hand, voices careful and firm, to discuss removing the anaconda for safety, Elira asked to speak. The room fell silent, not because she was loud, but because she rarely asked for anything. "I was there before the houses," she said, her voice thin but steady. "Before the ferry, before the bend was feared." People shifted. Someone sighed. This was not the time, they thought, for stories. But Elira continued. She spoke of the riverbank as it had once been, long before the flood reshaped it. The reeds had grown thicker then, the mud softer, warmer. It was a place children were warned away from, not because of danger, but because it belonged to something else. The women knew it, the fishermen did too. They had seen the signs, even if they never named them. "This was nesting ground," Elira said simply. "Eggs, buried deep in the mud near the bend, laid season after season by a snake that had learned the river's rhythms long before humans arrived. Not one nest, but many, returning to the same place because the river there was calm, because the earth held heat, because it had always worked. Until the night it didn't. When the ferry capsized, it didn't just break apart above the surface. Its weight tore into the riverbed. Wood and iron crushed what lay beneath the mud, unseen and unconsidered. The current did the rest, erasing evidence as thoroughly as it erased lives. Elira had gone to the bend days later, searching like everyone else. She had seen the debris, she had seen the torn earth, and she had seen something no one else noticed or wanted to. Broken shells, crushed, empty, scattered along the edge of the water. "I knew then," she said, looking at the floor rather than the faces around her. "The river took from both sides that night." The anaconda came weeks later, thin at first, scarred. It did not rage. It did not hunt the village. It returned to the place where the river had failed it, where everything it had left beneath the mud was gone. And it stayed. Not because it didn't know how to leave, because it did. Snakes moved on when nests were destroyed. That was the way of things. Survival demanded it, but this one did not follow the rule. It coiled itself against the current, against the past, against a loss that could not be undone. Year after year, it returned to the same stretch of earth, as if remaining there were the only act left to it. The room was quiet now in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Elira lifted her eyes. "You think it guards us," she said. "It doesn't. It guards what it lost. We just happen to be here." No one argued. There was nothing to say that would make the truth smaller. Fear had given the anaconda a role that fit human understanding, a monster, a threat, a danger waiting to strike. Grief was harder to accept, especially when it did not belong to a person. Outside, the river moved as it always had, but inside the village, something shifted permanently. The anaconda was no longer a mystery. It was a witness. And for the first time since the flood, the bend was no longer just a place people avoided. It was a place they remembered. After Elira spoke, The village changed without announcing that it had done so. There were no meetings, no votes, no formal decisions, just a quiet adjustment, like a body learning how to carry an old injury without flinching every time it moved. People stopped calling the anaconda it. They still didn't go near the bend. Respect did not erase caution, but the fear lost its sharp edges. What remained was something heavier and slower, a feeling that settled into the chest and stayed there. Understanding had replaced imagination, and somehow that was worse. The anaconda did not change its behavior. That was the part no one could ignore. It did not leave after the truth was spoken. It did not shift closer or retreat farther. It did not react to the watchers who now stood at a distance, silent and still, observing it the way one observes a grave. The snake remained exactly as it had been, coiled against the earth, aligned with the current, existing in a state that was neither life nor death, but something in between. The elders spoke quietly among themselves. Animals, they said, remembered differently, not with words or stories, but with place, with repetition, with returning again and again to the point where something broke. The anaconda was not waiting for its eggs to return. It was waiting because leaving would mean accepting that they never would. During the next flood season, the river tested that resolve. Heavy rains upstream sent water rushing down with familiar violence. Logs tore free. Whole sections of bank collapsed farther along the shore. People watched from higher ground, tense, bracing for disaster. When the water reached the bend, it swelled and pressed hard against the anaconda's coils. The snake did not retreat. It anchored itself, body tightening not in attack but in resistance. Debris struck and slowed. The current bent and split around the massive form, losing its force before it could tear further into the bank. When the water finally fell, the bend remained intact, scarred but standing. No one cheered. What the anaconda did felt less like protection and more like endurance. It held because it had always held, because that was what remained to it. The villagers began to understand that the snake was not saving them out of kindness or instinct. It was simply refusing to let the river take more from that place. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Is it sad? Does it know? Why doesn't it leave? There were no easy responses. Adults spoke of animals feeling things differently, of memory without language, of grief without tears. Some said the anaconda stayed because it didn't know how to do anything else. Others said it stayed because it did. Mateo returned often, standing farther back than he needed to, watching the water slide past the coils that had once slowed him enough to live. He never approached. He never offered anything. He understood now that presence was enough. The river continued its work elsewhere. People drowned downstream in other years, other bends, other storms. But not here. Not where the anaconda lay, heavy with memory, refusing to move on. What frightened the village most in the end was not the size of the snake or the power of its body. It was the idea that grief could last that long, that a living thing could choose a place of loss and remain there for years, not because it was trapped, but because leaving would mean forgetting. And the anaconda, vast and silent, did not forget. It stayed, and in staying, it forced everyone else to remember too. The decision arrived the way decisions always did, from outside. A video appeared online, shaky and distant, showing the anaconda coiled at the bend while floodwater rushed past. Someone had added music. Someone else had added a warning. Within days, people who had never heard of the village were arguing about its safety. The comments were loud, confident, and absolute. That thing is a threat. It's only a matter of time. Someone will die. Authorities followed the noise. They came in clean vehicles, wearing uniforms that signaled expertise and distance. They spoke calmly and often, repeating the same words as if repetition could soften them. Risk assessment, public safety, relocation. No one said kill, but everyone understood that relocation did not always end with survival. An animal that large, that old, that rooted to one place, did not move easily. And sometimes It did not move at all. The village gathered in the community hall, the same place where the ferry victims had once been named aloud. Papers were spread across tables. Maps were unrolled, lines drawn through places that had never been lines before. The bend was circled in red. "It's not natural for it to stay," one official said gently. "Something is wrong." Matteo stood, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. He spoke of the flood, of the pressure beneath the water, of how he had lived when he should not have. Others followed, fishermen, elders, even those who had once demanded the snake be removed. They did not argue that the anaconda was harmless. They did not deny the risk. They spoke instead of patterns, of 17 years without a single death at the bend, of a presence that had become part of the river's balance, however uncomfortable that idea made people feel. Elira said nothing this time. She only watched. The officials listened. They took notes. They nodded. And in the end, they said what they had come to say from the beginning. It only takes one mistake. The truth of that settled heavily in the room. If the anaconda stayed and someone died, the village would never be forgiven. Not by the law, not by the outside world, not by itself. If it was removed and the bend changed, if the river took again, there would be no way to prove what had been lost. There was no good choice, only a final one. The next morning, the river lay calm. Mist clung low to the water, blurring the bend until it looked almost harmless again. The anaconda rested as it always had, vast and still, unaware of discussions happening far from the weight of its body. Equipment was prepared, trucks waited at a distance, people stood along the shore, silent, divided not by opinion but by fear of being wrong. Matteo stepped forward, then stopped. He realized something then that made his chest tighten. The anaconda had never acted in its own interest. It had stayed where it hurt. It had stayed where everything was gone. And now, once again, others were deciding what should be taken from it, for safety, for order, for reasons that made sense on paper. The river moved quietly past the bend. The village waited, and in that stillness, the choice that would change everything was about to be made. No announcement marked the decision. There was no final speech, no raised voices, no moment that felt large enough to hold what was about to happen. The village learned the outcome the way it learned most things, through absence. The trucks left without sirens. The equipment was packed away untouched. The officials drove on, their maps folded, their red circle erased by distance. The bend was not cleared. The anaconda was not moved. Instead, the riverbank was marked and closed, not as a danger zone, but as protected land. No fishing, no boats, no construction. The curve of water that had once been avoided was finally left alone. For a while, nothing changed. The anaconda remained coiled in its familiar stillness, body heavy against the earth. People came no closer than before. They did not watch longer. They did not speak louder. Respect did not need witnesses. It only needed restraint. Then one morning, the snake was gone. There was no drama in its leaving, no struggle etched into the mud, no broken reeds or torn earth, just an emptiness where weight had always been. The river flowed freely through the bend, smooth and unbothered, as if it had been waiting for permission to move on. Some said the anaconda had died quietly in the night, slipping beneath the surface to settle where no one would see it. Others believed it had finally left, its vigil complete, its grief loosened enough to allow departure. No one proved either version, and no one tried very hard to. Matteo stood at the edge of the protected bank, looking at the water that had once nearly taken him. It felt different now, not safer, not calmer, but honest. The bend was no longer held in place by memory alone. Whatever had been anchored there had released itself. The river did not take another life that year, or the next. Floods came and went, debris piled elsewhere. The bend changed slowly, reshaped by seasons rather than force. Children grew up knowing the story. not as a warning, but as a reminder. They were taught that not every guardian bears its teeth, that not every act of protection looks like action, that sometimes the greatest strength is staying where it hurts the most, until staying is no longer needed. Doña Elira passed away one quiet winter morning. At her request, no memorial was placed by the river. She had said enough in her lifetime. The water did not need more words. Years later, visitors still asked about the bend. They stood where the anaconda once lay and tried to imagine the weight of it, the patience, the time. They rarely succeeded. Some things could not be understood unless you lived beside them. The village never built there, never crossed it again. The river was allowed to curve the way it always had, carrying with it the memory of a night when it took too much, and of a creature that stayed behind to make sure it didn't happen again. And if you stood there at dawn, when the mist clung low and the water barely moved, it was easy to believe that the river remembered. Not the fear, not the loss, but the stillness that once held it back.